everyone, it's George here. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that it's not been 2 weeks since the last Guns on Pegs episode, and you would be correct. The reason you have a new episode in your feed today is because we are, or rather Scribehound is launching a new podcast. This is a podcast concept that I have had for a very long time, and I'm really excited to see it come to fruition. It is called Beyond the Hedge, and it is a documentary-style podcast. It's hosted by Patrick Galbraith, the former editor of the Shooting Times and a Scribehounder. Each episode, he's going to do a deep dive into a particular topic or theme that is relevant to a countryside audience. The first episode, fittingly I think, is around the concept of countryside writing. He speaks to three people in this episode who have particularly deep knowledge of that topic. It's really interesting. It's a really cool format. We've decided to share it on here because we're pretty sure that you guys are going to like it. It will have its own feed. You can go and find it now on your podcast platform of choice. Go and subscribe, hit that follow button. And if you enjoy it, do please let us know what you think. Drop us an email, pod@gunsonpegs.com. Share it to your friends, all that lovely stuff. Anyway, enough from me. Let's get to the first ever episode of Beyond the Hedge.
Hello, and welcome to Beyond the Hedge, a podcast from Scribehound, where we go in search of the people, places, traditions, and tales that shape Britain's rural landscape. I'm Patrick Galbraith, an author, an editor, and a journalist. For the best part of 7 years, I edited Shooting Times magazine, and in 2021, I had a book out called In Search of One Last Song about the people trying to save Britain's disappearing birds. In this podcast, we're going to head out into the countryside to talk to the people who make it the fascinating place it is. I want to talk to publicans and butchers and grey partridge keepers. In the coming months, we've got episodes on everything from native cattle to hedge laying. I think it's going to be a really interesting ride, so do come along. In this episode, we're going to be thinking about rural writing and what it actually means. What makes good rural writing? I guess you've got nature writing, rural writing or countryside writing, and then you've got field sports journalism. And there are definitely overlaps, but there are also big differences. And I want to think about why those differences exist. I'm going to head down to Hampshire to talk to Jonathan Young. Jonathan edited The Field for almost 3 decades, and I think he probably knows better than anybody what makes a good piece on field sports. I'm then going to go and chat to John Mitchinson, the founding publisher at Unbound. I want to ask him, what do people actually want to read at the moment when it comes to the rural British landscape and everything that goes on there? And then lastly, I'm going to go and speak to Guy Adams. Guy Adams is a veteran on the features desk at the Daily Mail. He's also a Scribehound writer. Do have a look at his stuff. He has been at the Daily Mail during a period when they've started to focus a lot more on digital. And I want to know, how is the media landscape going to change? And are things like Substack and Scribehound the future? Getting all the way down to Hampshire from London is never a particularly easy journey, especially at rush hour. But when I got there, Jonathan was just as I remember him, except that he swapped his Marlboro Light for a vape. He was sitting there in the kitchen at his farmhouse, smoking his vape. And I asked him something that I always meant to ask when we worked together, but I forgot. Which is, how did it all begin? How did Jonathan end up initially on Shooting Times magazine? And how did his interest in field sports begin before that?
They're barking because my local farrier is running some sheep on some of our land. Yeah, I grew up on the estuary. And when I say grew up on the estuary, the deeds from our house went down to low water mark. So you could pull the boats in on a running line and you could just go out on the river fishing and wildfowling. It was absolutely fantastic. I've only had one interview in my entire life, and that was for Shooting Times. And then I had a very nice lunch at the Savoy with Sir David English, who said to me, "Would you like to edit The Field?" To which I replied, "Yes, please, Sir David." I joined in 1982. I was given 3 things which I was told I needed as a journalist on Shooting Times. which was an imperial typewriter, a bottle of famous grass, and an ashtray. And in those days, they were very clever. They gave you a title as assistant editor, which meant that they could ask you to do absolutely anything. Yeah. But in those days, once you'd sent off the copy to the typesetters, there was this lapse in time so the courier went at 4:00, and after 4:00, you could pretty much pull out the Marlboro Lights and have a whiskey.
One of the things that I wanted to know from Jonathan was how the content that they ran in his day on Shooting Times, which he edited prior to the field, differed to the content that I ran in mine, if it differed at all.
The news element on Shooting Times was very strong in those days. So you would be covering something at the weekend. It might be the British Open Sporting Championship or the Peterborough Hand Show, and you'd be armed with your penthouse camera, and then you would dash back, get in early on Monday. You'd then take your black and white film to the in-house developers. They produce a contact sheet. You then run up the photographs, write your copy, and then that would go on the 11:00 courier on Monday.
Right.
And then it would appear in the magazine on Thursday morning, which is pretty good.
What Jonathan didn't know is that before I went down to see him, I managed to find an issue from 1982, a December 1982 issue, priced at 55 pence. It's got a very snowy picture on the front, a Springer Spaniel, and inside there is, I think, the first ever piece that Jonathan wrote for the magazine, which is about rough shooting on Islay. And I wanted to know how much of that trip he remembers.
It was the most wonderful trip. The shooting quality was extraordinary. The wild game. I mean, we shot. I know we shot over 30 woodcock on that particular trip, as well as a heap of other stuff. And we were staying in a not terribly windproof caravan, and there were 4 of us and 3 Labradors.
Jonathan's piece begins, and it's very well written actually. It begins, a party of greylags hung in the air in greeting as we drove to the caravan that was to be our base for the week. And what really strikes me with that, apart from it being well written, is how long these young journalists managed to spend out of the office writing about interesting things. I think, when I was on the magazine, even as editor, I could get out for a day, maybe 2 days. I think I went to Finland once to hunt moose for 3 days and froze my nuts off. But we certainly couldn't get out for a week to spend in a caravan anyway.
Because, as I say, we were all called assistant editors, we were expected to do reportage, both words and photos. So it wasn't like we had specific sub-editors who stayed at base while the rest of the team went out and did the stuff. If you had the inclination, even as a 22-year-old, you could get out there and get the story and file the story, and that was extremely satisfying. And that was totally accepted.
One of the things that has always struck me when you look at Shooting Times archives and Field magazine archives is that although the quality of photographs has got better in the sense that cameras have got better and printing has improved, the quality of printing has improved, I think there's a case to say that actually, in the 70s and 80s probably, field sports photography was brilliant. I think then you had photographers who really knew what they were looking for, and I think they really knew what readers wanted to see. And I wanted to know from Jonathan, how he feels field sports photography has changed in the past 20, 30 years, and how he tried to use photos most effectively to get the very best out of the words that his writers were submitting.
What was interesting about Shooting Times then is that most of the pieces were long form, so they were around about 900 to 1,000 words, and per page illustrations were minimal. And one of my jobs was the copy would come in, and then I'd ferret around in a filing cabinet to find a black and white image that was vaguely appropriate. And yes, I spent a lot of money on photographs when I was editing The Field, and I really admire the photographic art. But I think what the photograph has to do is to enhance the story. If the photograph catches a particularly memorable retrieve or a particularly memorable shot or someone scooping up a salmon, if it adds to the story, then I think that's very valuable. I suppose what I don't like is photographs of grinning faces, because I think, well, so what? If you don't know those people, is it of any interest to you whatsoever? And one of the things I did make sure when I took over The Field is I said to all of my photographers, look at the back page of a newspaper, the sports page. Do you ever see a footballer sucking on an orange? And you never do. So the footballer is always doing something.
Yes,
he's kicking a ball or he's making a save.
Although there were some greats that came before Jonathan, people like Tower Bird and other names that those who've really delved back into the archives will be familiar with, I think it's probably fair to say that Jonathan was at Shooting Times anyway during its golden era in terms of writers. You were able to pay people sufficiently that they could do it professionally. I mean, somebody could go all the way up to Scotland as a freelancer and shoot grouse for a couple of days, and the fee they were paid, it wouldn't probably pay for their shooting, but the estate or the shoot would have them up there in order to promote the shoot, and what they were paid would more than cover their expenses, and it meant that they could basically just get on with it. And what I wanted to know from Jonathan was, who did he think were the greats? Who was he sort of most excited to edit?
The lineup from when I joined included Gough Thomas, who wrote a weekly gun column. We had Colin Willock, who was Tan Gun, he was the producer of Survival, which is, at its time, it was the planet Earth. We had Peter Moxon, we had Fred J. Taylor. We had Lee McNally, who was a professional stalker on what was the estate called? Easter Ross. And Arthur Oglesby, BB. There was still this breed out there called the sportsman naturalist. I'm not so sure such a breed exists in such plentiful numbers today. In fact, I'm fairly convinced it doesn't.
I think at one point, to be a member of the RSPB and to read Shooting Times wouldn't have been that odd at all. Actually, I think a former vice president of the RSPB held the record for the number of black grouse shot in a single day in Scotland. We've come a very long way since then. The person that I always think of when I'm thinking of conservationist shooters is probably Sir Peter Scott. Now, Sir Peter Scott, I think, would have been quite an old man when Jonathan started on Shooting Times, but certainly he would still have been around.
He was absolutely charming. I'd taken down my copy of Morning Flight and Wild Chorus, which he signed for me. And he said, well, there's no one else around now, Jonathan. Let's talk about wildfowling. Sir Peter was extraordinarily keen on wildfowling.
I think those of you who've read any sort of sporting journalism or sporting writing will know that wildfowling often makes for the best stories. I don't know whether it's something about the places that wildfowling takes place out on the marsh. It's a very beautiful landscape often, and the sky can be very beautiful. The wind even can be very beautiful in a bleak way. I remember one night lying in bed, I think I was shooting the next day actually. I was at a farmhouse in East Lothian and I sort of rolled over to turn the light off. And as I did, I saw a book there, a collection of an anthology of stories about wildfowling edited by Jonathan Young. I picked it up and I read a couple of them, and it was really brilliant actually. I wanted to know from Jonathan why he thinks wildfowling makes for such good writing.
Well, I'll talk about one of the pieces that's in that book, and it's by Hugh Folkus. And it's a story of a widgeon that gets pricked, and then it has a miserable existence until eventually the rats find it. So you wouldn't think of it as a classic wildfowling story. But what I liked about that book was the humanitarian aspect.
One of the really interesting things, I think, if you look at shooting times from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s, is that wildfowling was sort of everything to shooting times readers. For many of them, it was all they did. And you still meet guys, I'm going to go and see some guys quite soon actually, who said to me, guys on the Humber Estuary, who said to me they've never shot a driven pheasant. They said actually they've hardly even seen pheasants. All they do is go out on the marsh. But that changed and people started to get involved in driven shooting a lot more. It became something that wasn't just for very wealthy people. It became sort of democratized. And I wanted to know from Jonathan if you can pinpoint when that happened, or if people were aware of that happening, or whether it just kind of crept up on everybody.
I think there's a definite transition, a generational transition from that sort of shooting and that sort of low key, but really interesting to driven stuff. But on the other hand, I still think you can find amongst the very keenest of all, and really quite well-to-do people, there's still a strong interest in wildfowling and pigeon shooting.
Writing about nature is having a real moment, but writing on the countryside, real countryside writing, doesn't seem to be doing quite so well. So book publishers, big book publishers like Faber, Bloomsbury, HarperCollins are really doing very well financially out of publishing books about leaves and moss and snow and whatever it might be, but not the sort of thing that you can find at any farmhouse anywhere across the country. Old books on pigeon shooting, gun dog training and so on, and often those books were published by very mainstream publishers, which is an interesting thing. And I wanted to know from Jonathan why that's changed, whether that market's still there, whether people just actually don't want to be associated with field sports anymore, or what it is.
I think it's not that it's I just think it's become less normal. So when I grew up in Devon, the fact that I walked out my door with a gun over my slip to go wildfowling didn't attract comment. And the policeman that came round to give me my shotgun certificate when I was 13 had quite an in-depth conversation with me about ferreting. I just wonder whether it's just the edging away from a rural to an urban society. I've got a ton of cloth-covered books in maroon and green in my library, written by people who had modest but interesting sporting experiences and careers. But I love them. I absolutely love them. But they're like a time capsule.
It's funny how life goes. Just after I stopped editing Shooting Times, in fact, I think like the day after, I was at Soho Farmhouse doing an In Conversation With event with John Mitchinson about the first book I wrote. I really enjoyed the conversation, but afterwards at dinner he said to me, well, what are you doing now? And I said, you know what, I've not actually got much of a plan. And by the time we had coffee, we'd decided that I could go out there and find interesting people in rural Britain who might write interesting books for Unbound. But when the brief came through, it said emphatically not nature writing. And I wanted to know why. And, nature writing is very popular. So what does John think there is in terms of a gap in the market for the sort of things that he wants me to find? I went to his offices in London Bridge to ask him.
I'm basically a writer and a publisher, and I alternate between those two things. The publishing that I do is Unbound, although I have worked for traditional publishing since, for 30 years. And I was a bookseller before I was a publisher. But Unbound uses crowdfunding, but it's really about trying to bring writers and readers closer together. I was struck me that the commissioning process now in publishing is particularly that's dominated by such big kind of conglomerates that getting interesting books through is more and more difficult, and actually going out and getting the support for a book in advance is a very noble and ancient way of trying to publish. It was certainly what they did in the 18th century, subscription in advance.
But what I really want to know from John, because he's said it to me a few times now, is what is the difference between nature writing and countryside writing? Because I think there's a lot of blurred lines between those two things, but certainly there are some people who feel that nature writing is their thing and countryside writing isn't part of that, and then there are people who very much don't want to be nature writers and feel like countryside writers, and then you've got people who feel that actually they are just storytellers and they don't want anything to do with the whole thing.
The difference for me, I suppose my interest is because I live in the countryside and have done for 30 years, is I'm fascinated by the stories of the people who are actually physically engaged in work in the countryside. And I think to some extent, while I mean, let's be honest, there is a lot of nature writing which I love. I am and will defend to the hilt the work of Robert Macfarlane. I think he's a great writer, but he is a writer, and he happens to write about walking, and he happens to write about nature and landscape. Underworld is not really nature writing at all. So, I mean, for me, another great writer about nature, Roger Deakin. I mean, not a practitioner, but Waterlog is just a brilliant bit of book. And then on the other side, there are, they're kind of the historians of the countryside, which I think do a really important job. Oliver Rackham being the one that I always come to, kind of the great history of woodland, and going right back to one of my favourite books, which I still go back to, which is W.G. Hoskins' The Making of the English Landscape, where that's kind of history and nature, and how, I mean, I suppose for me the really important thing is we live in a completely artificial environment, and while I'm as kind of, romantically love the idea of rewilding as everybody does, and I'm also really fascinated in the ways in which we have, over the centuries, learnt to live and work with nature. I'm very, very smallholder. I no longer have sheep, but I still have pigs and bees and chickens. And to me, it's the interaction with landscape, rather than this kind of slightly more escapist, isn't nature wonderful? Yeah, I mean, I think understanding and watching and observing, and a lot of the people who know most about nature, I've found through my experience, if I talk to my local gamekeeper, who are often cast as the bad guy, kind of, they actually are much more acutely aware of what's going on in the environment than people who are just wearing Gore-Tex and wandering through it with their Ordnance Survey maps. I mean, I think most sensible people recognise that actually, if you're going to have an intelligent relationship with nature, then you have brutality, death, are all part of the equation, and you kind of have to figure out what you think. I mean, I'm clear about that farming, regenerative farming, where you're giving back to the land and you're looking after your animals and you're trying to kill you keeping them as humanely as possible. That to me seems like a very, very sensible route. I don't think anybody who's had anything to do with kind of the mass industrialized farming thinks it's either very, very good news for the animals, very good news for the planet, or actually in lots of cases very good news for the people who are involved in it.
Talking about bloodiness and brutality, some weeks before I went to see John, I went north, and when I was there I stopped in to see Patrick Lorry. He had a pig hanging up in his shed. There was some cold weather coming in, and he decided that it was the right moment to slaughter the pig for Christmas. And I was delighted to hear, just after I'd recorded this podcast, that Patrick has become a Scribehounder. It's a very interesting point, I think, that, look, I would love to read a novel written by a taxidermist in East Anglia, or an eel fisherman, or a thatcher. I'm sure there are thatchers and taxidermists out there who write very well, but it's hard to find them. I've tried. And I wonder whether fiction actually represents the countryside in a more interesting way, because if you're a good novelist, if you're a good writer of fiction, you can inhabit those roles. You can bring those lives to life on the page. So the question really that I wanted to ask for John, one of the many questions of course, is whether fiction is a better way to represent the real countryside than non-fiction.
I think it's a really interesting idea, and I think clearly, our relationship with the countryside has been, from the Romantics onwards in particular, through the great 19th century novels of, Hardy into Lawrence, that kind of presentation of rural life, fiction is an amazing. I mean, you're right. I mean, who can read Cider with Rosie and not just love it? I mean, what I would say is that the interesting thing in all of those books is it's always to do with people and landscape.
Since we recorded the podcast on rural writing, it was announced officially that Richard Negus has signed a contract with Unbound for a book on a hedge layer's view of the English countryside. And just as excitingly, about 2 days after that, Richard came on board as a Scribehound writer. I guess we could say that in some ways, subscribing to support a book in that very old-fashioned way that John has revived in a radical way is not unlike Scribehound, really. It's trying to bring writers and readers together, and it's trying to create a space where readers can see the sort of thing that they really want to see published. It's undeniable that print media across the board, from newspapers to field sports magazines to, magazines about trains, are not doing as well as they did. Shooting Times sold 60,000 copies a week in the 70s. It's now probably selling 10. I wanted to know, why that's the case. I think, look, I consume a lot of media on my phone and on my laptop, and I really enjoy that. But, I think there are people who feel that print gives you a unique reading experience, and I wanted to know whether Jonathan, as a reasonably analogue guy, feels that way or otherwise.
So at the moment, you and I are surrounded by mini computers. And we are being bombarded with stuff the whole time, and it's quite addictive. But that's a very different experience from picking up a good article in print with a glass of wine. And you've got your terriers who, for one moment, haven't buggered off, and they're actually sitting quite happily by you. But that's a very relaxing experience. And I think one of the worries about the decline of print media is that until the populace learns how to relax again, it's very difficult to get that back, because there is noise, but you can escape. And one of the reasons those articles, both in the field and the long form articles in Shooting Times and the field, worked well, is because you can escape somewhere. You can be sitting here and you can be on that marsh if the writing's good enough.
Even though print journalism is in decline, there's a lot of appetite for daily reads. So things like Substack is doing very well. Newsletters are doing very well. Scribehound as well is having a very, objectively, it's having a very strong start.
What I like about Scribehound is you can write pretty much whatever you like, and if people don't like it, well then they don't click onto it. At the moment, I'm dwelling on a piece of whether or not to actually go into print about how ghastly mycelium terriers are at escaping. I like the attitude of the contributors. They wouldn't describe themselves as experts, and I worked with people that were real authorities. People like Arthur Oglesby on salmon fishing, or Lee McNally on stalking, or Peter Moxon on gun dogs. And they were such clever and wise countrymen that they realised there was so much more to learn. That I'm always wary of anyone who describes themselves as an expert. And they would talk about and write about very amusingly about days that went badly. I think that rings true of all of us who pursue field sports, is that sometimes it goes quite well, and other times, and it can be down to a small detail, actually it really doesn't work.
I felt like saying to Jonathan that for me it almost always goes badly, but I tend to enjoy it. Having spoken to Jonathan about magazines and the heyday of magazines, and having spoken to John Mitchinson about what countryside writing means as opposed to nature writing, I felt it would be good to go and talk to somebody who thinks he might be the most disliked man in journalism. Guy Adams has been at the Daily Mail for a very long time, and he's of course a Scribehound writer, but he knows an awful lot about how rates for writing have changed. How do you actually make a living as a writer? And are platforms like Scribehound and like Substack going to give writers the ability to actually just get on and be writers again, rather than having to do lots of other things and only being able to focus on their writing for a little bit of time a week as a hobby, essentially?
If you were to take a sort of straw poll of the world as in terms of sort of people who use, say Twitter, what would make you more unpopular? Would it be being a writer for the Daily Mail, or would it be being a field sports writer? And I think they're probably sort of neck and neck. And so I get a sort of double bingo on that front. On my business card, it says I write features. In the Daily Mail, a feature, or in most newspapers, a feature is a kind of longer form article. My role tends to be when there's a story in the news on any particular week, I kind of go away and have a think about it and have a look at all the aspects of that story that maybe aren't getting into the 400-word news stories that are in the paper every day, aren't getting into the 2-minute news bulletins on the telly, and speak to all the people involved in the story, maybe even do the old-fashioned thing of knocking on doors, and try and come up with a story that, first of all, will kind of, for readers who haven't necessarily been following the story incredibly closely all week, will tell them everything they need to know, but will also move it on a bit.
I think one very interesting evolution in terms of print versus digital is that in the beginning it was always a case of you had your print publication and then you would kind of populate the website after that. Whereas now quite a lot of publications are actually going kind of digital first and they then fill the pages of the magazine. I wanted to know how Guy's seen that change in his time.
When the internet started off, you'd spend all day making a great newspaper, and then at midnight they'd take the contents of that newspaper and stick it on the internet. Whereas now a lot of newspapers, journalists get into the office in the morning and they'll look at what stuff's going well online, what stories are people excited about online, what do we need to do with our sort of online offering later in the day, and then they'll have a separate sort of team that comes in at 5 PM and goes, right, of all the stuff we've put on the website all day, what's going to run, what can we put in the paper tomorrow?
How do we consume media differently? I mean, it used to be the case that people would buy lots of magazines. I even remember at school everybody bought magazines. I probably read comics before that. We still consume media, but we definitely don't consume it in the same way that we did.
When I was a kid in the 1990s, I'd get a train. If you were about to get on a 3-hour train journey and it might be delayed or whatever, you'd have to go tooled up, and you'd have to have something to do on that train journey. So you'd go to WH Smith's and you would buy a newspaper, a magazine, and maybe a second magazine, and you think, have I got enough stuff to see me through this journey? And everyone on those trains, and I remember when I started out in journalism, I'd be commuting to the Telegraph's offices in Canary Wharf across London at sort of 9 AM, and every single person on that train would be reading a newspaper or a magazine, or occasionally a book. The consumption of journalism, it was something you needed to consume to fill the time that you were just otherwise you'd be bored in. If you go on a train now, I reckon at least 60 or 70% of the people on that train will have nothing with them to entertain them apart from a mobile telephone. But if you look at what they do, a lot of people will just. I get the train back to Wales from London every kind of Friday afternoon, and it's a couple of hours. You see people who will literally scroll through TikTok or other social media sites, Instagram, whatever, for 2 hours. The other thing that's definitely going to change, I think, with all newspapers, including my own, and I think it will change much sooner than we think, is the idea that you will just produce good content and you'll get expensive journalists who you send to travel places and, who cost a lot of money to run. that you get them. We for example have on the Mail, we've got a tennis correspondent, and he goes to every Grand Slam. He goes to Indian Wells. He'll go to Miami. The idea that you have a journalist on a decent salary who's a real expert, one of the top tennis writers in the country, and then they just write stuff and you give it away for free online. That era that's going to end. So I don't think any newspaper will still be around, any newspaper of any sort of quality will still be around with a site that's completely free to access in the way that Mail Online, for example, is now. Now, there might be bits of it that are free to access. You could, and if you were, you could sort of put, because there's different sort of types of content. So, yeah, lots of people are interested in Kim Kardashian's latest skincare range, or a picture of some celebrities on a red carpet. You might still put that stuff out for free, but if your quality content, your big name writers, the stuff that costs a lot of money, I think that stuff's going to go behind a paywall more and more. And I think it's important for people to realise that good journalism isn't free. If you're the Daily Mail, you can have a very successful website and actually it makes a bit of money. But if you're a magazine that has kind of big, long, posh articles in it, how does that translate to the internet? And the answer is it's very difficult to work out how to do that. If you're just relying on online advertising, if you're giving away content on a free-to-access website, you've got to have millions of people clicking on it to have a hope of generating significant amounts of money. It's very hard to write quality content and then wash your face if you're relying on online advertising.
Understanding the economics of the modern publishing landscape is really important in terms of understanding why you see the pieces that you see in magazines. I mean, it used to be the case that you would write a lovely long-form piece and people would subscribe to a magazine on the strength of that. Whereas now, even in my own time, we probably ended up running many more pieces on the 5 best gun slips for a driven day or the best boots for woodland stalkers, because it worked in tandem with advertising. So, what you saw in magazines was dictated a bit by advertisers, and certainly to a far greater extent than it would have been in the past. I was interested to hear from Guy how rates have changed, or actually not changed, in his time. I mean, he's been around for longer than I have.
To understand it, really, you have to go back 20 years or so, when I started out on Fleet Street. I was a young, wet behind the ears gossip columnist on the Daily Telegraph. And I'm also, I was keen on fishing and shooting and all the rest of it. And I started doing the odd freelance article for the Field magazine. At the start, it was just something that I was sort of interested in, and a bit of another string to my bow, and maybe a direction in different circumstances my sort of main career might have gone in. But at the time, an article for the Field magazine would be about 1,800 words long, and I would be paid for writing that 450 quid. An article, a big article, properly researched for that sort of magazine, it's going to take you, it's a lot of work. And if you want to do it properly, it's probably 3 or 4 days work. If I was writing an article for the Field magazine today, I would have been paid £450 for 1,800 words. In other words, their going rate had not changed for 20 years. And the reason for that, they weren't paying, their rates weren't bad because they wanted them to be bad. They were bad because of what's been happening in the media industry. So, print sales have declined quite precipitously. So revenues from subscriptions are down a bit. Revenues from advertising are down. And and the industry's been wrestling with how do you monetize online. For me, I already had a full-time job, and over time, I basically came to the view that, if someone wants me to write about something and it's really dear to my heart and I think it's a great idea, from time to time I would do it. And if they wanted to send me off on a nice trip, so I remember once about 10 years ago, they said, "Oh, would you like to go to the Turks and Caicos and do some bone fishing and then write about it?" And I thought, yeah, I would. I'd do that for free. But if it was, the sort of bread and butter journalism, I I couldn't really justify it. The great tragedy is that I think countryside writing has, in the last 20 years, actually lost a lot of people. There's been a lot of good young writers who've come along and you thought, they've got something to say, they're interesting, and they just couldn't make it. They haven't been able to make it work as a full-time kind of countryside writer. I think that's a terrible shame. And, if you care about the future of countryside sports, and if you care about sort of countryside politics and all the rest of it, then our community, all communities, they need a sort of robust media to bring people together, and also to keep our opponents in check, and to hold to scrutinise lawmakers, to do all of that stuff. So I think I really think countryside writing is important. It's important to support and sustain.
So is it really viable anymore to actually be a countryside writer? I mean, when you think back, you did have these people who kind of kept themselves, it probably wasn't a luxurious existence, but they kept themselves going on writing pieces for Country Life, The Field, Horse and Hound. Is that possible anymore?
Going back to talking about the vulgar business of money. So, I occasionally get asked, if I was trying to make a living as a freelance journalist, I think, and I don't know I think you would need to charge at least 50p a word for your copy. Whereas if you're a writer, and Substack has kind of shown this, if you can get 500 people prepared to pay you a $5 a month, then, and that is a tiny audience, it's a niche audience. Actually, writers who cover very particular fields can make a living doing that. And I hopefully Scribehound will provide a way for a sort of broad community of countryside writers to make countryside writing kind of a proper career choice.
When I was at Shooting Times, I always struggled a bit to get Guy to write for us. He did a piece on the way that politicians use field sports to bash each other with, which was brilliant, and people still talk about it. But we certainly couldn't get him in regularly. And, the Daily Mail pays well. So I wanted to know why he writes for Scribehound. What is it that he likes about the model?
What works for me about the sort of Scribehound model is that I can write whatever I want. So I've done 4 pieces so far, and 2 of those pieces have, funnily enough, been kind of stories. And I mean sort of news stories that I wouldn't quite be able to get into the Mail. They're a bit niche. One was about the RSPB, although, funnily enough, I did do a piece on the RSPB in the Mail a few weeks earlier, but it got more into the kind of nitty gritty of the internal politics of the RSPB. The second was a piece about the snaring ban in Wales and its impact on curlews. And again, I think it's an important subject and a story that needed telling. If I'm tipped off about a really good kind of country sports story, and I might be able to get it, if it's not big enough, if it's not sort of something that's going to make a spread in the Daily Mail, I can try. And sometimes I'll see if I can do a sort of small news piece in the Mail. But if it's just a bit niche and not quite got the kind of mainstream appeal, but is terrifically interesting to the sort of people who subscribe to Scribehound, I can just turn around and bang it out, and it will be up there on the website within a couple of days. And an exclusive story. And there's been some great stuff on Scribehound recently. I can't remember who wrote it, but there was. I read a really fantastic piece. It was something to do with they'd certified. You can certify woodland now as being green or sustainable or whatnot. And the people making the rules about that were saying, well, you're not going to get certified if you allow shooting in there because of some sort of theoretical idea that you might get a bit of lead ending up in a bit of wood and anyway, it was a forensically reported story that had not been anywhere else, and perhaps won't get anywhere else immediately, but needs to be told, needs to be out there, and people need to know about it and be talking about it.
It's a really interesting thing. I always used to think about people reading Shooting Times on a Sunday afternoon when the shops were closed and it was perhaps raining outside, but I don't think we have free time anymore in the way that we once did, and that really lends itself to the Scribehound model. I tend to read. I don't read every single piece that goes up there every single day, but I maybe read it 3 or 4 times a week. I'll read it in the morning, I'll read it when I'm out having coffee. I sometimes actually go to the pub and read a couple of pieces and I have a pint. I wanted to know how Guy reads Scribehound and how he engages with the platform.
The way I use it, I don't get on there every single morning and read that day's, and some people might, and it just depends on your lifestyle. But every 2 or 3 days, I might have, half an hour to kill, and I will know I can get I normally use my iPad actually. I'll get my iPad out, and I will catch up with the 3 or 4 Scribehound pieces that have been published in the last few days, and I know there will be. You're not going to love every piece because different people like different stuff. But I know that if it's been 3 or 4 days, I can go onto Scribehound and there'll be a couple of articles I really like and really make me think. And it will be a good way to fill that time. And the other thing I'd say about I'm sort of interested in Scribehound is sort of getting to know the readers a bit and why people are choosing to subscribe. And it's been quite interesting because everyone has a different reason, and I hope over the sort of months to come that there'll be chances to interact with readers a bit. Maybe I might show my face at the game fair for the first time in a few years. The idea of a community, I think, you can start an online community, but actually, if it starts spilling over into real life, I think that'd be really nice.
I learned so much from those conversations, not least that Jonathan Young had it pretty good when he was on Shooting Times with his Marlborough Lights and his famous grouse. But all of those conversations left me with the sense that there will always be an appetite for good writing, whether it's in newspapers, magazines, or digitally. And I think what I learned when I was at Shooting Times more than anything was that writers produce their best stuff when you let them write about the things they want to write about. When I stood there with Patrick Galbraith looking at that pig that was hanging up in his shed, he pointed at the pig and said, "This is the sort of thing I want to write about." And that's what the team at Scribehound is trying to give writers the chance to do, and they're trying to pay them properly for writing about the things they want to write about, and that really matters. Good writing, it can take you from one place to another. When it's a long week and you're working hard and it's raining outside, you read something good and it takes you to the marsh, or it takes you to the hill, or it even takes you to the local pub if that's what the piece happens to be about. And that is important. That's really important. So I hope you continue to listen to the podcast, and I really hope you continue to enjoy the pieces that are going up on Scribehound.
Over the coming months, we've got some very interesting episodes. I think the next episode of the podcast, we are going to be talking about woodcock. We're going to be talking about shooting woodcock over a Whistler. I'm going to be talking to Tim Adams about the best way to cook woodcock. And, it's become really chic to say, "Oh, I don't shoot woodcock. I don't think we ought to shoot woodcock anymore." We're going to be exploring that. Is that right? Or is that just a sort of tedious thing to say when you've run out of anything else to say on a shoot day?
Thanks very much for listening to Beyond the Hedge, and we can't wait to get out with you into the countryside in the months to come. This episode of Beyond the Hedge was presented by me, Patrick Galbraith. It was edited by George Brown, and George Brown was the executive producer. Beyond the Hedge is a Scribehound production.